Okay, let's do this. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Perry Ekimai channel, where we are continuing our journey through the LDS Truth Claims series, answering them one at a time. In this one, we are going to get into what kind of translation the Book of Mormon is even supposed to be. McDonald starts his presentation with two broad points about historicity that I find to be both incredibly agreeable and important to raise. He states, quote, "History studies the past, and historicity studies the authenticity of the events recorded in a text from the past." We are largely in agreement here. I do wonder if historians would accept these definitions or quibble with some of the specific terms, but they seem more than suitable for our purposes here. He continues, "The question of the Book of Mormon's historicity is simple. If it has historicity, it is a translation of an ancient document, just as it claims. If it has no historicity, then it is a modern document making deceptive claims about history, even if it could be seen as inspirational." While I might have some quibbles of my own with the specific implications of this point, for example, historicity is not just a simple binary of yes historicity or no historicity, the contention being made is suitable for our purposes here. He then argues a point that I have mixed feelings about. He states, quote, "The Book of Mormon isn't a text from history. It declares that it is the translation of a text from history. Thus, the expectation that it should reflect an ancient culture that produced it will be mixed in with the virtually inevitable presence of the world of the translator that presents the text in terms that make sense to the culture and time of the translator." On the one hand, yes, I do agree that a translator has to make certain decisions that will alter the meaning of the original text in order to make the translation understandable to a target audience. These sorts of trade-offs happen all the time in document translation. One could even argue that there is no unified theory of what a good translation actually is. However, a lot of translation quality assessment models, a whole growing field of research, seem to land on accuracy, clarity, and naturalness in the target language as significant factors for a good quality translation. Uh, and some examples are linked in the description below to that. In general, a good translation feels natural to a reader in the target language, but the intent of the original text is preserved. Consistency is also noted as an important factor in a quality translation. For a historical text, some of these considerations get even more complicated. However, it should be obvious that when translating, for example, a Mongolian text detailing the conquest of the Khan, the use of modern English terms and syntax is not inherently a problem, but changing certain nouns, such that outright anachronistic content appears, is the mark of either a poor translation or an inauthentic document, or perhaps both. If the Khan destroys or breaks through the Great Wall using mortars and an airstrike with a UAV drone in the translation, reader trust would certainly be broken. A quality translation of a historical document would not entirely divorce the source text from its historical context. An interesting example of this appears in the case of the Apocalypse of Abraham, which is preserved only in Slavic texts from about a millennium after the original composition. In her dissertation on the subject, Dr. Paulson Reed pointed out that a combination of provenance, preservation of idiomatic structures, and word plays that enhance the text, and as well as preservation of proper nouns, all help to identify the text as both authentic and originally Semitic in composition. In the case of the Book of Mormon, we are left with effectively two possibilities to explaining its origin. Either Joseph Smith or another 19th century person is the author, or it's ancient. Understand that if pressed on defending this dichotomy, I would probably open up the possibilities much wider, but the dichotomy presented here is suitable for our purposes. MacDonald argues that the Book of Mormon claims to be a 4th century composition translated by a 19th century translator. This is partially correct. Much of the text is claimed to be an abridgment composed in the latter half of the 4th century into the early 5th century. However, the small plates are claimed to be written by the hands of authors from the 6th century BCE to the 1st century BCE. Furthermore, certain specific sermons, epistles, and other quotations are understood to be transcriptions from authors across multiple centuries. Also, the Book of Ether, though a 4th to 5th century abridgment, does include what are supposed to be direct quotations of much, much more ancient text. What I wonder is just how much of this original text survives the filter of Joseph Smith. Can the filtered text be distinguished from a text that is fully the product of Joseph Smith? MacDonald argues that there are three types of translations: literalist, functional, and conceptual. Basically, literalist aims to get as close to word for word as possible, with some limitations due to syntax or semantics. Functional aims to preserve the intent of the original text, but is a bit more flexible when it comes to vocabulary. And conceptual holds the original text at arm's length, preserving the meaning of the original text, but little of its structure, form, or vocabulary. The more that the translation of the Book of Mormon is described as a conceptual translation, the further the apologetic case gets from what the witnesses claimed about the translation process, and the further it gets from being an actual testable value for the historicity of the Book of Mormon. To his credit, MacDonald does present a case for a literalist translation of the Book of Mormon. He points out, especially when it comes to names, that there are both witness claims to names being spelled out and manuscript evidence that suggests that Joseph Smith would correct his scribe if errors were made in the spelling. There are also the cases of Kurlams and Kumams in Ether 919 and Neas and Shum in Mosiah 99. Ether 919 is notable because it includes animals which favor a literalist or tight translation and a functional or conceptual or loose translation, such as when horses and asses are also mentioned. But let's go ahead and put a pin in that for right now. MacDonald endeavors to argue for Book of Mormon historicity through the preservation of proper nouns that have potentially plausible Old World connections. First, he introduces four names that have a potential connection to Egyptian: Korihor, Panchi, Pakumani, and Gideani. I've seen other variations of this list that also include Pahoran. Part of what is supposed to make this list so exceptional is that all of these plausibly Egyptian names are found only in Nephite records, and the story involving some of these characters bears a resemblance to a story from 400 years before Lehi left Jerusalem. The only way that I see the first part of that argument working is if you remove Korihor from this list, because Korihor, spelled with a C, is found in Ether 7:4 and is a Jaredite name. The difference between a C and a K before a vowel like an O in English is minimal at best, with little to no semantic difference. As for the second part, we are left with a coincidence. Whether the Book of Mormon is historically reliable or not. If it is, then there is a coincidence in a historical event having weird parallels to an event that transpired halfway around the world 1,000 years earlier. If it is not historically reliable, then there is a coincidence in similar names in a pair of stories that were written halfway around the world and 3,000 years apart. As a data point, this issue is neither compelling for the critical or apologetic cases. In terms of Hebrew names, MacDonald argues that there are some Book of Mormon names that are both plausibly Hebrew and not found in biblical sources. He starts with Sariah. I wonder if this could not be just as, if not more so, plausibly explained as being a bit of a blend of the names Sarai and Sarah as found in Genesis. His next example is that of Alma. The apologetic case is anachronistic and would require the name to be shifted independently to a masculine use in two different cultures located halfway around the world from each other. In other words, the discovery of a masculine use of Alma in the Holy Land in the second half of the first century CE is immaterial to how it could have plausibly been used by historical Lehites. As for the critical argument, masculine Alma was a reasonably common name in Joseph Smith's milieu. He may have even known a male Alma or two, or more. I think Mormonism Live has done more than enough to put this matter to bed, but RFM and Colby Reddish did review it in their response to the Light and Truth letter, and I would recommend checking that out. Links in the description. In terms of names and proper nouns, we may have a strong case that the Book of Mormon was a literal translation, or we may have a case that Joseph Smith was familiar with the Bible and the cadence of biblical names, and apologists have done a great deal of legwork to find plausible connections, wherever they can find them, to Hebrew, Egyptian, or Semitic names. MacDonald then discusses evidence for functional or conceptual translations. I'm now worried that he will allow this heading to serve as a justification to conflate these two paradigms. His first example is of grammatical errors that are more likely the product of Joseph's own poor grammar rather than what was found on the plates. And in general, I do agree on the surface that it is likely that the poor grammar found in the Book of Mormon is largely a product of Joseph Smith's own poor grammar. He then moves into a discussion about Hebraisms. I find this curious as there is low probability of Hebraisms in a functional translation as compared to a literalist translation, and lower still for a conceptual translation, assuming that the intent of the functional or conceptual translation is to bring the translated text closer to the culture and understanding of the target audience, rather than it being an attempt to mimic a known text of Hebraic origin. McDonald makes a very important point here when he states, quote, "The Book of Mormon contains Hebraisms. The problem we have in using that information in our discussion of the translation process is that we need to know what the data mean. We have two possible sources for Hebraisms. Either A, a faithful retention of the plate language and grammar, or two, this is an error on his part where he jumps from 8 to 2, the influence of the King James translation." Referring back to Dr. Paulson Reed's dissertation on the Apocalypse of Abraham, she noted that Hebraisms, such as the ones identified by apologists for the Book of Mormon, were important in demonstrating that the text of the Apocalypse of Abraham was Hebraic in origin, but they were among the weakest pieces of evidence for establishing that conclusion. This is because it is difficult to distinguish between those kinds of Hebraisms with what she called biblicizing Greek. She used that term because the alternate hypothesis for Apocalypse of Abraham's origins was Hellenistic or Greek. In the case of the Book of Mormon, we need a way to distinguish between a genuine Hebraism showing Hebraic origin and biblicizing English. I am very glad that McDonald brought this point up. McDonald does not propose a systematized method or framework for assessing whether a proposed Hebraism is better explained as being a retention of what was on the plates or the result of the influence of the KJV, or alternately, just mere apologetic bias. This is a good opportunity then for me to go ahead and introduce the three factors of the Book of Mormon Hebraism assessment framework. These are one, intentionality, that the proposed Hebraism is the result of authorial intent, not mere coincidence or apologetic bias. Two, pertinence, that the proposed Hebraism pertains to the Hebrew language and it is sensible for a translator to preserve that text with that particular Hebraism intact. And three, that it's unavailable, that the proposed Hebraism is not found in the milieu of potential alternative authors such as Joseph Smith. Only a proposed Hebraism which can meet all three criteria can begin to be considered as compelling evidence for Hebraic origin for the Book of Mormon. A proposed Hebraism that fails to meet all three criteria may be a valid Hebraism, but it is not distinguishable from a Hebraism that comes from the influence of the KJV or mere apologetic bias. Let's look at some examples of Hebraisms with McDonald and apply the Hebraism assessment framework to determine whether any can fulfill all three criteria. The first Hebraism that McDonald presents is the if and conditional clause. In the first edition of the Book of Mormon, there were 14 instances of if statements that were resolved with an and outcome. Royal Skousen has argued that this is a manifestation of a Hebraic grammatical form where and is used to resolve at least certain conditional forms. There are no occurrences that I'm aware of in the KJV of if and conditional clauses, which would satisfy the unavailability criterion. While 14 occurrences may seem like it is sufficient to establish the intentionality criterion, the significant concentration of these references to Helaman 12, as well as their removal in 1837, causes me to question the strength of intentionality. Where this fails is in pertinence. As I have noted before, I am not trained in Hebrew, and therefore my technical understanding of this issue is limited to what has been published by LDS scholars and apologists on the topic. It is interesting how difficult it is to find other scholars of Hebrew discussing this conditional form, though this may be due to what I have found out about Hebrew and how it actually uses like changes in verb tense to resolve the conditionals. Even without this technical understanding of Hebrew, we could consider an example from another language. In Japanese, the character to is first taught to language students as meaning and, especially in sentences with a list of a defined and definite number of elements. Who are the three witnesses? Well, you have David Whitmer, to, Oliver Cowdery, to Martin Harris. However, there is a certain conditional form that uses to, and what this form does is it looks for where the consequent necessarily follows when the conditional is fulfilled. Of course, because Japanese is a very difficult language to learn for English speakers, this is a gross oversimplification of the structure. However, we can use it to make a point. If a translator of a Japanese document took a to conditional and rendered it as and, that translator would be awful at their job. In other words, it is not sensible to preserve that meaning in this translation. The same could be said of the Hebrew conditional structure. This means that we should consider alternative explanations such as a known phenomenon, like the scribe making an error due to mishearing the dictation, or another likely phenomenon such as the one offering the dictation getting lost in the conditional structures. This means that we should consider alternative explanations, such as a known phenomenon like the scribe making an error due to mishearing the dictation. This is one of the things that came up on the Book of Enoch material. Or another likely phenomenon, such as the one who was offering the dictation getting lost in the long conditional structure and misspeaking. Either of these would better account for the 39 other instances of proper English conditional structures being found in the printer's manuscript. Chiasms and other parallelisms are another and rather popular example of Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon. Intentionality can often be difficult to determine due to the highly repetitious nature of Joseph Smith's dictations generally. Some chiastic structures are found in the Doctrine and Covenants, and it would be hard to argue that Joseph Smith intended to put a Hebraic chiasm in those places. The more intricate chiasms that would be useful for establishing intentionality have sizable gaps or missteps that undermine their value. They certainly meet the pertinence criterion. However, these structures are found in the KJV, which means that they are in the milieu and fail to satisfy the unavailability criterion. But does the ubiquity of the chiasms in the Book of Mormon not create some indication that they are uniquely Hebraic? Well, there is a reason why I do not have a criterion regarding the volume of Hebraisms in the Hebraism assessment framework. What critical mass of Hebraisms moves the text from biblicizing English to Hebraic origin? I have not seen a coherent case made in either direction. In the parallel case of the Apocalypse of Abraham, no such critical mass case was made either. Instead, the quality of the Hebraisms is what was considered, with the ones that were the least likely to come from a Hellenistic author considered the strongest variety of evidence. Volume just does not seem to be a reliable criterion to include in the Hebraism assessment framework, and that is why it is not included. In an effort to support a functional translation, as opposed to a literalist or conceptual translation, McDonald makes some points that I believe undermine the credibility of the Book of Mormon as a translation of an authentic historical record. The reference to, quote, a dumb ass in Mosiah 12, 4 through 5 is noted because there were no asses or other beasts of burden in Mesoamerica, or the pre-Columbian New World for that matter. Ether 919 includes a reference to both horses and asses, the latter of which MacDonald admits were not found in the New World. This means that Ether 919 somehow requires both literalist and non-literalist translation modalities in the same verse. At best, this is sloppy work on the part of the translator. At worst, in 3rd Nephi 15:17, Jesus refers to the other sheep of John 10:16. MacDonald rightly points out that sheep were not found in the pre-Columbian New World. This reference, as recorded in the Book of Mormon, would have been nonsense to a Nephite audience. The inclusion here is indistinguishable from a text produced solely from the mind of Joseph Smith. A similar problem comes up with the reference to harrowing in Alma 29:4, which refers to an agricultural practice that would not have existed among the Lehites. Though a resolution could be reached by, as MacDonald points out, claiming that the source text referred to an emotion that could be understood to an English-speaking audience with the term harrow, uh, absent a source text to examine, this claim is just speculation, and it is indistinguishable from being merely the product of Joseph's mind. 3rd Nephi 125 makes a reference to jots and tittles, which is a problem because this is a reference to anachronistic grammatical features that are referenced in the New Testament. In other words, indistinguishable from being a product of Joseph Smith's mind. Honestly, McDonald continues to do my job for me in comparing Mosiah 16:10 to 1 Corinthians 15:54, Alma 5:52 to Matthew 3:10 and Luke 3:9, and Moroni 7 to 1 Corinthians. It is amazing to me how many of the words of the Book of Mormon can be accounted for just by looking at Genesis, Isaiah, the Gospels, the writings of and attributed to Paul, and Revelation. This doesn't account for everything, as there are references to Exodus, Ezekiel, Malachi, Acts, and other biblical texts. So much is just Paul and Isaiah. MacDonald defends this problem by saying the meaning of the language would have been on the plates. The form of the resulting translation cannot represent a literalist translation of the plate text. The witnesses to the translation that MacDonald appealed to earlier largely agree to the idea that it was a literalist translation guided by shining words upon a stone. However, as MacDonald notes, this cannot be the reality. I wonder why we would rely on these witnesses for other claims, especially supernatural ones, if they can be shown defending such obviously incorrect claims. Of course, the problem is that his argument for a functional translation is wholly indistinguishable from a dictation that is wholly the product of Joseph Smith's mind. It would be unfair of me to not consider the argument from how the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon structures the Isaiah quotations. This is that it puts the quotations into three sections that correspond well with how there are natural breaks in the text of Isaiah. This would perhaps be impressive if the breaks were non-obvious, or if Joseph Smith was not low-key obsessed with Isaiah. MacDonald argues that the organization of this quotation in the 1830 edition is not consistent with the KJV, which better reflects some original plate structure. Ignoring the problems with the idea of Nephi engraving into metal plates a quotation of Isaiah that would just be materially lifted from the KJV, this point fails to distance Joseph Smith from the work. MacDonald argues that the text is best explained as a functional translation. All I see is a translation that is indistinguishable from a naked dictation of the product of Joseph Smith's own mind. MacDonald claims that critical arguments assume a literalist and an errant translation. While I do think the translation witnesses point in that direction, as well as claims made in the introduction of the text, I am open to the possibility that a functional translation was used. However, in order to accept this conclusion, I would like to see apologists like MacDonald demonstrate how a functional translation is meaningfully, substantially, and evidentially distinguished from a dictation that is solely the product of Joseph Smith's own mind. Absent such a testable framework, the functional translation hypothesis just looks like an apologetic excuse to retreat to the domain of unfalsifiability, which, to my estimation, is not a reasonable standard to hold. Perhaps the example of horses will help. Spoiler, it will not. In this example, MacDonald argues that the case of horses in the Book of Mormon can be treated as either, one, a literalist assumption that horses is representative of the precise term used on the plates, or two, a result of the Nephites and Jaredites creating a word for a mystery animal that, instead of preserving the Nephite word, Joseph translated functionally as horse, or three, Joseph, in a functional translation, misapplied the term horse to some Nephite animal. I wonder in what way two or three could be shown to be distinguishable from being the mere product of Joseph Smith's own mind. MacDonald argues that there is no evidence for the literalist assumption. To do this, he goes to Alma 18:9, where horses are fed so that the horses and chariots could be prepared for the king. MacDonald argues that the horses are never ridden by men and are not described pulling the chariots, though this begs the question as to why here, and in Alma 26, it is exclusively the horses that are mentioned in immediate proximity to the chariots. The animal known to pull chariots is mentioned next to the chariots each time. I would consider that a rather evocative connection between the two, suggesting some sort of special relationship. But maybe twice is just a fluke. Three times, now three times might actually be a pattern. And that's what we get with 3rd Nephi 3:22. Brett, you have to stop doing my job for me. I find Brett's actual next argument to be kind of hilarious. You see, horses and chariots, Brett contends, are mentioned in a list of belongings. Right after the chariots, we start to see cattle and flocks and herds and grains. So the horses, which are mentioned before the chariots, are probably included as food, right? If that's the intention, which is possible, horses are food in some cultures, then we have to wonder why chariots are in the middle of this list of foods. I wonder what a Nephite chariot tasted like. Brett argues that because the horses are not shown doing the things that horses did in Mongol or European societies, the use of the word horse in the Book of Mormon does not necessitate that being the source word in the translation. And sure, you can say that if you would like to, Brett, but it is not the most reasonable interpretation of the data. The consistent proximity of horses to chariots throughout the Book of Mormon suggests that there is an intended relationship between the two. If we had the Book of Mormon we have today, but there had been horses on the American continent in 100 BCE, apologists would not be making the arguments that they are making, like the one that Brett is making here. Brett contends that discovering the conditions and culture that were relevant at the time of a text creation should explicate the text in ways that the wrong production culture would not. We may expect that, regardless of the relationship of the translator to the text, the mindset of the original authors of a document should come through. And I agree with Brett here. If this is a functional translation of an actual historical record, then the voice of the original authors should still manifest in the text. However, everything we have discussed so far has failed to distance Joseph Smith from the text adequately to suggest other authors were involved in the production. But perhaps when we get into the text of the Book of Mormon and discuss the context of the ancient world it claims to be set in, we can find a way to separate the translator from the text enough to hear the voices from the dust. Until then, I do not see how we are justified in accepting as true the claims made by and for the divine origin of the text. From here, our journey through the LDS Truth Claims series will take us to Father Lehi and the Old World context of the early 6th century BCE. But until then, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do all the fun YouTube things, and I'll catch you in the next one.